friends and colleagues really don't understand, even if there's a newspaper in name only still hanging around, what we're about to experience with regard to the disappearance of this class of people that we call reporters, who are also a class of people who really have our backs and are looking out for us. So that's all turned out, plus or minus, to be true. I think you're on mute, Lori.
I am indeed. I want to make sure that the dog doesn't start barking and interrupting everything. But you started the Texas Tribune 10 years ago, and by all accounts, as a nonprofit, it's incredibly successful. So why didn't you just kind of like dust off your hands and say, I'm done now? 10 years later, you've jumped into the American Journalism Project and co-founded it. So talk a little bit about that thought process.
Well, I'd like to dignify it as a thought process, but I'll do my best for Russian history. About 4 years into the Tribune, it was running well enough, and just by good governance hygiene, I sort of backed away to the point that I was no longer chairman of the board. I was no longer even on the finance committee, and that's my situation today, and I couldn't be happier. And they are off doing just incredible things. I go to other meetings of nonprofit journalism organizations, and I sometimes feel like when I come back to a Tribune board meeting that those guys are playing sort of three-dimensional chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. They've really made enormous advances. I mean, you're never out of the woods. They always need money. They're still in a situation where half of their revenue comes from major philanthropy. So the clock starts again every year, but we're very proud of where they are and what they've done. I then sort of slid off to Santa Barbara, started playing tennis again, and continuing to do software projects, but couldn't get out of my mind this notion that I'd had from the very beginning, that the problem with the news industry generally was just the lack of capital formation, given that commercial capital markets had really vetoed newsroom growth as a strategy, and had done so rather forcefully. I always joked, and it's not a very funny joke, that there's so much money in my day job of venture capital. There is so much money hanging around. The guys like me will fund just damn near anything, but not local news. And so that's a pretty good sign that you got a market problem. You're going to have a capital formation problem. And so I had just been thinking about that on, and think about this notion of kind of a venture firm on for a long time, when I ran into this woman, Elizabeth Green, who's my co-founder. She's on the other coast. She's 20 years younger than I am. She is a reporter by background, not a business person. And she and I had precisely the same idea. And so I kind of thought, this might be worth at least examining. We literally kind of had built the same spreadsheet. And so, I thought that I would, here was this bright, energetic young thing, and I'd play, eminence gris old man. And before I knew it, she was chairman of the board and I was CEO. So that didn't work so well, but everything else has gone pretty well. We're very early, and we got a lot of work to do, but we're now a team of, I think, a dozen, and making some real progress.
So I'm going to back up a little bit and give some context to what you said a little earlier about the state of the journalism industry. And here's some statistics that I think help put some things in perspective. The number of reporters in this country has declined 60% since 2000. Some 1,800 communities have no local news source at all. Since COVID-19, and that was just March, scores of publications have shut down, and some 36,000, that's 36,000 journalists, have been laid off, furloughed, or had their pay cut since the pandemic began. So now let's layer on the increasing distrust in the media, a global pandemic, and a new and urgent priority on equity issues. it's a lot. But can you see it as an opportunity for journalism?
Well, we don't have much of a choice. We've got to. It's a. I don't say this in big audiences, but it's going to get to the point where where Japan was with its industrial complex post World War II. The good news is we're going to get to start pretty much from scratch. Those statistics that you read off are sort of breathtaking, but and this is not received wisdom. This is just our opinion, but it's our opinion having done a ton of analysis. We really do believe that the focus of the problem is newspapers, just because they have for so long provided all the original reporting. That they're not doing such a great job right now, but they still provide the lion's share of reporting. Just to give you a sense for what is about to happen, and a lot of you read this in the press and probably know it, but of the daily newspaper readers in the United States, when the McClatchy deal closes here in a few weeks, McClatchy was the second largest newspaper company, was in bankruptcy. It's now going to be owned by the hedge fund that had lent it a bunch of money. But when that deal closes, roughly half of all daily newspaper readers in the country will be served by a newspaper that is owned by a hedge fund or a private equity firm. That's generally not good news, just because hedge fund and private equity firms, I work in that kind of business. We have one objective, which is to make money for our shareholders, and we really don't have any duty, explicit or implied, to anybody else. And so we've seen that over the last, call it 5 years, as the financial sponsors who own those properties have begun to bleed them. What we're about to see is nothing like we've ever seen, because what COVID has done is really advanced the downward acceleration of the industry by at least 2 or 3 years. That's primarily due to print advertising, but digital as well. What it means is that these properties are going to, even when they come out of COVID, they're going to have 20+% less revenue than they had. And very few of them were operating with 20% operating margins, which is a long way of saying they're going to start losing money, which has never been a problem for good-sized newspapers, like ever. They've made less money, they've had to do cuts, but the notion that they are actually losing money is sort of the big damn deal, especially since the way their capital structure is set up. Those papers are carrying, and I hate to get so in the weeds on finance, but it's important. They're carrying $3 to $4 billion of debt owed to a bunch of guys, and they're all guys who don't have tremendous sense of humor, much less civic pride. And so what really is going to happen to half the newspapers in the country over the next 1.5 to 2 years is they're going to enter a state of self-liquidation, where there's just really no other strategy than to drop expenses faster than revenue falls. And there's absolutely no strategy for increasing revenue. And so to us, that's sort of red alert, that when you've got half the newspapers in the country going into a process of forced liquidation, things are going to get really different really fast. And people, once this original reporting starts to go away, people who are griping about the quality of their Facebook feeds now are going to have a real thing coming when there's literally no professional reporting sitting underneath all that stuff.
So this doesn't sound like it could get much grimmer. So what can the people who are in this room do? I mean, I suspect there's a certain level of helplessness going on out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I always say that this is it's just has felt for a dozen years like a long bad marriage. Just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. And that's continued to be sort of true over and over again. We see reason to be optimistic if people are ready to get energized around the prospect. And so what we're proposing, let me back all the way up. What AJP intended to do when we kicked off was we were going to stand up 25 or 30 examples of nonprofit news organizations that were, air quotes, sustainable, that other people could sort of learn from and do the same thing. And the assumption there was that newspapers would still be around kind of for the foreseeable future, not forever, but we would help fill in gaps that would inform how the ecosystem would look once the nonprofit ecosystem was more advanced and more economically stable, and once the newspaper industry had gradually decayed. What happened instead was we have entered immediately a kind of post-newspaper environment. That doesn't mean there won't be newspapers. It doesn't even mean there won't be some newspapers making real contributions. But for the most part, our planning assumption is that in the next year or two, newspapers with regard to civic contribution will be irrelevant. And so what that means is we've got to build a whole infrastructure of iNews sources and Texas Tribunes and Chalk Beats and the 19th and these 200 or 300 organizations that are membership, that are in Sue Cross's membership. Not only do we need to do that, we need to build a really intelligent infrastructure around them that helps them deliver what we call minimum viable journalism, really, really cost effectively, really wisely, sharing costs, sharing best practices, and knitting themselves into a nationwide network of nonprofit news that functionally replaces newspapers. It's going to be very different. It's going to be very much, it's going to be very exciting in many ways. It is going to be very much more nimble, very much more two-way in terms of its communication. We are really dead set on it being super, super important that the whole kind of civic motion is building community through local journalism, as opposed to just reporting on stuff in the community through local journalism. It is going to give us the opportunity, because we're going to grow these newsrooms by such a factor. This is the time when we can diversify the business, and this is the time when we can diversify the kind of coverage that we're delivering so that it reflects what our nation looks like. Right now, we're in a very difficult spot because we have a shrinking industry that we'd like to try to make more inclusive. I can tell you from experience, that is one of the hardest things on the planet to do when you got a shrinking industry, to make it more diverse. And we're going to be better. We're going to focus on the stuff that the market does not focus on. We're going to leave, real estate and classified advertising and dining and sports to the market, because there are markets for that. My joke is that if you take the New York Times on Sunday and you pull out the book review, we're kind of the book review, right? With regard to the content that we really need to produce to keep civic society informed. And so it's we've gone from a kind of, I joke that we've gone from pitching ourselves as sort of an order of French fries to the double beef Whopper, right? We're going right to the center of the plate, being unapologetic about it, and having to be a little bit more confrontational with regard to the ultimate place of newspapers than is sometimes comfortable. But frankly, there are a number of newspapers that we just feel like ought to. My joke is the best way to get to save newspapers is to get them the hell out of the news business. That they for the most part confuse the discussion. They're not helping. Doesn't mean there aren't great people doing great work, great well-intended work. They're just not structured for what we need.
Lori, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just keep muting myself. I've said already, and I'll say many times more, that we're incredibly grateful for AJP's confidence in us. And, iNewsSource is an investigative accountability journalism organization. So we don't do a lot of daily stuff. We really focus on the kinds of accountability work that is hard to do and that many others are not equipped to do or will not do. So what was it about iNewsSource that inspired the AJP confidence, and what special challenges do investigative outlets like ours face in this landscape you've just painted?
Well, I think what inspired us was it is a difficult problem. In the software world, we always joke that everything is defined by a 2x2 matrix, 2 axes, and you always want your company to be in the southeast corner of the matrix. That means you're doing good stuff and you're cheap. If I think about investigative reporting on a local level, it's just the opposite. You're in the southwest corner because you're expensive and your market size is small. And so from a business proposition, that's kind of the triple lindy of journalism. It's the hardest to pull off economically because your distribution and what anybody would quote unquote pay for it is never ever going to make up. Not that that's easy in any journalism, but it's just never going to make up for what it costs. And as I'm sure Lord has told you, investigative journalism is expensive because it's resource intensive, but it's also expensive because it's not linear, right? You don't go A to B to C. There's a story. Often it goes A to B to X to J, and you got nothing, and you got to start over again. And so it's both expensible and unpredictable. And so what we saw in iNewsSource was a group that had accumulated a community of interest that seems to have gotten the joke that this is both expensive and necessary, and was well along toward thinking about iNewsSource as a real important civic institution, as opposed to a commercial sort of add-on to a more conventional news organization, which typically treats its investigative units as sort of eye candy and the occasional attempt at a Pulitzer.
Mm-hmm. So John, there's the model in Philadelphia where a foundation essentially owns the big newspapers, and some newspapers have turned into nonprofits. But in terms of thinking about the landscape that you've talked about in the commercial aspect, what's the nonprofit equivalent? I mean, what do you think of a model of a nonprofit foundation controlling a whole bunch of the media in an area and merging the nonprofits together? Is that a good idea?
Oh, it might be. And control, it kind of depends on what you mean by control. I mean, for a brief second, the Knight Foundation expressed an interest in buying McClatchy. Had the economics of that been not so awful, I think that likely would have been a good thing. There would have been governance and branding and issues, but that's a pretty benevolent overlord as they go. I'm glad McClatchy didn't buy those papers, because I think those papers are an economic wreck, and I think that anytime. And I understand I'm just a software investor, which is about the simplest business in the world. It doesn't have manufacturing, it doesn't have distribution, it doesn't really even have inventory. And so the whole notion of, because all of these newspapers ultimately are going to have to get rid of their print operations, that just makes me want to curl up on the floor, the complexity of that relative to starting a digital organization from scratch, which ain't easy either. But I just start at, God, if I've got to wind down print, that just feels like kind of, Vietnam and Iraq rolled all into one. You just get into you can get into really ugly stuff there. So I think there are two different questions. I'm not concerned about a foundation controlling a bunch of properties, just because I don't see that happening. But I am really encouraged by a group of philanthropic investors really giving us a leg up in growing the number of really excellently run nonprofit news institutions, such that that is not a it's not an exoticism, and we're making some progress on that.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn this over right now to Alina. She's our donor engagement manager. I think most of you have probably spoken to her on the phone. And we've gotten some questions in advance of this event. And Alina, why don't you go ahead and pose them to John?
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to see you all, and thank you so much for your incredibly generous support of iNewsSource. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Your partner.
We've received some wonderful questions, and I'm going to start with one by Michelle Chin-Proussel, which is, how do you keep balanced, honest journalism thriving when so much alternative information is rampant?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if anybody has read Ezra Klein's book on why we're polarized, but I was just finishing it last night, and he said something which was awfully obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it that way, which was, anytime you have a transfer of a revenue dollar from a conventional newspaper to a social media platform, that's a dollar that culturally, reputationally meant that whatever was being put out, they don't always get it right, but whatever was being put out was culturally required to be fact-checked. And that dollar is going to a platform that not only disavows their ability to, or their responsibility to desire for doing any fact-checking. Not only that, it's now pretty obvious that those platforms are built to amplify the least fact-checked of the information that enters the platform. And so we've chosen to take the rather brute force mechanism, which is, it's just like, I can't remember the justice that said the only way to drive out bad speech is more good speech. We just kind of feel like the only way to drive out counterfactual information is with stuff that's fact-checked, and to do it as surgically as we can. And on the demand side, that there's going to need to be, over time, more and more civic education, more and more media literacy education. But I see a backlash coming. I mean, at some point, I think people are going to wake up and go, this has hit a tipping point of absurdity, that maybe we do need to go back and check some relatively objective, not objectivity, but objective standards in who's putting our news together. And again, I just want to go back and put in a plug for reporting, because when I talk to even my really bright friends, they've really lost the scent, a lot of them, because they're in a social media feed, and the whole notion that there's a big difference between a story that got there because it's a professional who is paid to look out after our interests versus not, is just an enormity that I think is, in all this mess, I think that's the core thing that people have lost track of, is we have 3 million teachers in this country who we trust to watch out for our kids. It'd be nice if we had, 1/100th of that, which would be 30,000 reporters whacking away at the local level. That's $2.5 billion a year. It's not in national defense or even in education terms. It's just not that much. We spend almost $600 billion on education.
Thank you. So I have a question here submitted from Phil Blair. And the question is, what are your thoughts on the UT owner wanting to sell to a nonprofit?
Well, I joked to Lori yesterday. I said, well, what's second prize? I don't. In general, well, first of all, in general, what has been true in general, I'll tell you the story of the Austin American Statesman, which traded about 2 years ago to Gatehouse. My home paper is now owned by Gannett, and I had wealthy, well-intended friends who called and said, "What do you think?" And my response was, "Well, what are they going to pay you to take it?" Because they had the same pension stuff, they had the same, and the brand had deteriorated terribly. And oh, by the way, my stepsons were 13 and 15. The Statesman's never going to be relevant to them. Do you really, is that a brand you want to buy? It traded to Gatehouse for $55 million, at which point I thought, oh my God, we've got to go do this project because this is just going to go on and on and on and on. And so at some price, maybe, but man, can you imagine the amount of damage you could have done with $55 million? Right. And that's not like that. They bought a bunch of cash flow with that because it very immediately went to near zero. So that's our entire fund. I without knowing anything, I would say start from scratch, or, you know, give that money to Lori and to Scott Lewis and let them handle it.
Thank you. So I have a question here from James Tiffany. So outlook on Civic News survival in the next 10 years. Will different leadership in Washington, D.C. make a difference?
Well, one would hope. It's difficult to see how it would get, I always hesitate to say things like this, a lot worse. For Civic News, and I'll get on my just kick me off my soapbox when you guys get tired, but Civic News, the whole sort of underpinning of our work is that Civic News at the local level is a public good. And what that means is the market just won't let to its own devices produce enough of it. And as newspapers have gotten more and more diminished, their ability to do that just out of some sense of civic duty has gone almost to zero. And so if you're going to ask about the future of Civic News over the next 10 years, it's going to have to be funded either by philanthropy, by and large, or by some piece of the public treasury. That doesn't mean that there won't be corporate. We need to retrain. We need to rethink the way we think about corporate support of news, and we can do that, but it'll never be what advertising was. We need to really rethink the way we think about membership, and you can call that philanthropy or you can call it commercial, but for sure that needs to be rethought. But that still leaves a lot of this stuff funded by people writing good-sized checks on a sustaining basis every year, and or some support from the public treasury. And so I think we're setting up for a discussion of public support of local news that a lot of people are timid about going into, but it's just, there's no doubt in my mind that it's a discussion we got to have. But in the absence of that, either temporarily or permanently, there's got to be a lot more philanthropy if you see this landscape like we do.
So I just want to insert something here. So I think, in my view, one of the biggest problems out there in terms of the whole media landscape is people essentially think that news is free. I mean, you've just talked a lot about how intense investigative journalism is in terms of cost and expertise and time, and it's not a straight line and all those kinds of things. But how do we combat that?
Yeah.
You talk about how tied to social media so many people are, but it used to be back in the day, you had to buy a newspaper to get your news. You also had to buy one to buy a car or find a job or any of those things. And now people just say, well, I ask them, where do they get their news? And they say, well, just on my phone. So
Right.
it's kind of like not a lot of awareness of where that's produced and where it's coming from. And we haven't even gotten into Facebook and Twitter, and maybe what your thoughts are on freezing those accounts.
Well, I think, and we're moving furniture around on messaging all the time, and God knows we're 13 years in and I don't have it right yet. But my hope is that we're going to be able to humanize this a bit and get people to understand that they don't get good news, they don't get credible news without these human beings called reporters, any more than their kids get good teaching without teachers. And I think that's where we've got to drive the public, and that costs not that much in the grand context. You know, education costs $500 billion a year. That costs $2.5 or $3 billion a year. We're a society. We have choices. The newspaper industry at its peak was taking $60 billion a year out of our communities. We can afford $3. It's just going to have to come from different sources. That's the kind of discussion that I'm hoping we can have in a more civil time.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is from Robin Nordoff, and it is there any source of information to obtain the true facts without journalistic bias?
Well, we could go all weekend, because you got to unpack truth, you got to unpack facts, you got to unpack bias. But let me tell you what I'm hoping for, and that is a cadre of 30,000 or so people in this country who we pay to go find out what the hell's going on and come back and report to us, tell us about it. And I frankly am Justice Brandeis said that the most important job, most important public office is that of private citizen. Those are the people who help me do that job. And what I can tell you for sure is I got a lot of shit going on. And I'm not really sure how good a job I do at it without that kind of help. And so they're not always going to be totally objective. They're not always even going to be right, even after fact checking. They're not even always going to be completely fair. We would like them to be, and at AJP, as we put together our network, like INN, we're going to enforce a code of conduct that tries to keep it down the middle. But at the end of the day, the work has to speak for itself. Going back to the Tribune, I don't think anybody gives the Tribune a bad time about being anything but scrupulously nonpartisan. And I will tell you that the 5 people that were paying attention when we started that thing, my politics were pretty well known. It was my money. And so they thought there were, it's a beard for George Soros, and there were going to be light blue helmets in the street anytime. It didn't happen because the work was really good, and Evan knew that he had to put out credibly nonpartisan stuff, and the limousine liberal buddies of mine who funded the thing to begin with are now just completely swamped by conservative money. There's far more conservative money that has funded the Tribune over the last 12 years than progressive money.
So speaking of money, I'd like to return a little bit to what you mentioned earlier about the conversation about government funding. It's been actually talked about mostly in academic circles, I think, for 10 years. And now it's very much starting to become part of the public conversation. And David Furman, who's one of our board members, read the Victor Pickard book, Democracy Without Journalism. And he asked that about the government should the government be funding journalism? And do you think politics or the military complex is capable of not interfering if that were the case?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll answer the first question, or the last question first. It ain't politics and it ain't the military complex. It's us, right? I mean, it's we the people. It's what choice do we want to make, and what are we going to require with regard to the systems and checks and balances in most industrialized democracies, certainly in the West. They haven't had much problem. I mean, BBC gets in a tussle every once in a while, but if he read Victor's book, he knows what the frame is, which is we who spent pennies on the dollar on public media versus other Western democracies. I mean, pennies on the dollar. We have been very laissez-faire in our regulation of media companies, of everything, but of media companies. And we've been extraordinarily dependent on advertising. I mean, the thing that I think the framers would really, of all the things, I think about this all the time. If they were to come back and say, okay, fellas, what surprised you? I think they'd say, this advertising thing ended up being kind of important, right? Because I don't think anybody saw that coming, right? That the fourth estate was really going to be this advertising dependent. And so if you're not going to regulate the platforms, if you're not going to bring back advertising, which you're not, if you're not going to pay for advertising with subscriptions, and that's the most radical proposal out there, by the way, that just logically, economically, there is no history that would tell you that that's ever going to happen. You're staring at the public treasury and philanthropy. And so I think that what that obligates us to do is start not from the position of here are all the reasons why we don't want to do that, but rather take the position of, hey, we have choices, and we have agency as voters and individuals. What is it we want, right? How do we want to prioritize this? And if we want to prioritize such that the public treasury funds a bunch of local news, then how do we want to make damn sure that it's walled off and independent? We have choices. We can do that. It's real easy to say it'll never happen. But the problem the framers left us with is all the other institutions that were named in the Constitution. They also laid out how to pay for it. They didn't do us that courtesy as it relates to the press. So we got a whole wide range of choices.
Thank you. So the vice president of our board, Mel Katz, has just asked, so a small percentage of people of color subscribe to the newspaper or view local entities like iNewsSource. How do we attract them?
Yeah. Well, that is a longer and really urgent conversation. One of the things that, and this is a little bit about the public funding conversation. One of the things that distinguishes AJP's view on this is that if we're going to rebuild this infrastructure from scratch, it has to be equally available to everybody, full stop. Jefferson is often quoted as saying that he'd rather have a government of newspapers and no governing officials rather than the other way around. But what gets lost is he said, so long as every human, every citizen gets to read those newspapers. And so what we are championing is a setup where everybody has all the important stuff, if you will, is in front of the firewall. Everything that you need to do your job as a citizen is in front of the firewall. That doesn't mean that you can't, and we do at the Tribune and other places, charge for premium content. But what it does mean is that we need to start thinking about membership as not providing us entree, but rather providing everybody else entree. And I think this is a really important concept as we turn this corner, because if you think about in a democracy, it's actually not particularly, and this is a little heretical, but it's actually not particularly important that I'm informed. What's really important is that y'all are informed, right? Because you got to, ultimately, you got to take care of me. I'm one vote. You're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so I'm a whole lot more interested in you being able to carry my water than I am just being smart. And I think that's a real challenge that we have from a messaging standpoint. It's up there with the importance of reporting. But I've got a reasonable amount of faith in this country, or at least large segments of it, that they'll ultimately get the joke and know that is an enlightened generosity.
I think just to follow up on that, John, I think many of us think that the way we can engage communities of color and underserved communities has been really about getting out there and getting in the communities and getting them to know us and trust us, and listening, more importantly, listening to what they want to know, as opposed to our telling them what they should know. It's a huge challenge now could be another 6-8 months, a year, before we're able to get out into those communities safely to have those conversations. Do you see any kind of interim actions that?
That's a really good question. I mean, we're in the startup work that we're doing. We're intensively doing these listening sessions. That I think that went particularly well in Berkeley, or rather in Oakland, where they had to do those by Zoom. But what we can certainly set you up with the folks who have been going through that in this environment. And I've been really, particularly in Oakland, I've been really pleased and impressed with how quickly that community accepted that organization. And I think it's because that listening got done. But God, I've learned, I have learned more in the last 2 years about engaging communities of color than I have the rest of my life. It's so complicated, because it starts with having a newsroom that looks like the community it serves. It goes to covering issues that in commercial media we're not very advertising friendly. For the most part, they didn't drive a lot of subscriptions. The editor of the Miami Herald, in a very public forum the other day, said, listen, we cover 4 of 39 municipalities in Miami-Dade, right? They got a long way to go in having the credibility of their friends of color. But I think what we've decided is we just got to make that a first principle and design around it and really mean it. And it makes it expensive from a public treasury and philanthropy standpoint, because there's just not a commercial base to make that happen. But we gotta, otherwise I think we're wasting our time.
Yeah. Elena, do we have another question?
So we have a question from our staff reporter, Mary Plummer. So as we approach the 2020 election, what are your thoughts on how the role of nonprofit newsrooms has changed in the past decade?
Well, I mean, I'm going to try not to sound like too much of a cheerleader, but it's hard. I mean, if over the last 10 years, the number, and Lori threw out the number, but the number of reporters below the federal level has gone down, depending on how you count it, 30, 40, 50%. The number of reporters in nonprofit outlets has grown now from a small base by a factor of 7 or 8. And so this is where the growth is. This is where the dynamism is. And so in many, many places, particularly at state houses, the nonprofit news organization is the straw that stirs the drink. I mean, they're the ones that everybody depends on. And if you look at, and I'm always heartened by this, if you look, and awards aren't everything, but if you look at the major journalism awards these days, it's really rare, quite frankly, to have a commercial journalism organization win a major reporting award without being in partnership with a nonprofit. And it's not unusual for nonprofits to win them on their own. And it's not unusual for nonprofits to win them in partnership with another nonprofit. The Texas Tribune won the first Peabody ever offered for an interactive feature in partnership with ProPublica, and that was only 2 years ago. And so I just think there's a lot more credibility. There's a lot less who the hell are these kind of ankle biters, and a lot more cooperation, hopefully.
Thank you. So I have here a comment and question from Hal Fuson, who says that, as Lori noted, newspapers in our day served many readers' needs beyond local news. That suggests the audience for real news of civic value has been much smaller than journalists like to think. What do we do about that?
Not sure. Maybe there are a couple questions in there. Let's just go with the audience for civic news is smaller than, and let's leave the national out of it for a second. The audience for local news is smaller than journalists would like to think. I think you're wrong there, because I think journalists think it's pretty small. I think journalists have now been beaten about the head and shoulders about how small it actually is, and that's why they have to write, listicles in the 24 best places to cry in Charlotte, and what Jay-Z's cat is up to these days, and if that's what counts for national news. And so this is one of the $64,000 questions, is the stuff that we are bound and determined must be exposed is often not very, very widely read, and that's part of our conundrum. That's part of the notion of civic news as a public good. And it's part of why newspapers, I think, have gotten themselves in trouble, because there's this Newt Minow, who was the head of Federal Communications Commission in the 60s, when he was talking about television, he just came out and said, listen, there's a big difference between the public interest and what interests the public, and that we can't do a lot about. And so public interest journalism, what we are peddling, we are peddling alongside the notion that we've got to make it more accessible, more digestible, sort of put the pill in the peanut butter when you need to. But at the end of the day, this is information that just has to exist to make a civil society go. We want to get as many people to read it as we can, but what we really want to do is make it available to anybody who has any inclination whatsoever to do it.
So John, we're almost at time, and I want to respect everyone's time here, but I think there's an important question that just came in from Joyce Gaddis. Joyce is the former dean of the journalism school here at San Diego State, and she is wondering how schools of journalism navigate through these challenging times. What is their role? Outdated accreditation standards, you name it.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you guys have a hard job. It's funny though, because I have gotten in trouble with more than one of my friends who now have college age kids, and I'm like, shit, yeah, go to journalism school, it'll be great. And their parents are just like, are you out of your mind? But I mean, my view is, where else are you going to learn to do all the things, think critically, write, tech, have some sense for what's going on in your world, I think it's a wonderful education. You know, I think that, and I don't know the accreditation stuff, and I can only imagine the politics in the academy around all this stuff. But the interns that I've seen that are working at the Tribune and other places, they've been trained to be really useful kind of day one, right? They've been trained to do the stuff that they can walk into a newsroom and not have to be overly managed or led or coddled. And so I guess that tilts toward the more kind of tradecraft rather than the more academic, but I would have said that anyway. I'm not sure I offer anything all that unique on that, except I know you've got a real challenge from where you sit.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you to everyone for coming. We are at time, and like I said, I want to respect everyone's time. I feel like this has been a really informative, and hopefully you feel it's been a successful first virtual Spotlight Club event, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next one with Maria Ressa in August.
Don't miss that, good heavens.
Thank you all.
This has been
Thank you,
great.
John.
Thank you so much for
I hope
having
you'll
me.
be able to join us on August 19th.
That would be
Thanks
great.
so much, John.
You bet.